Well, I'm here with Frank Fiorenza. He is a board member here at the Potosi Brewery Museum. And Frank, this place, I can feel the history just leaching out of every nook and cranny. This was a pretty big undertaking, wasn't it?
It was a monumental undertaking. In fact, a lot of people thought it was beyond salvaging, but we were able to do it with the dedicated group of volunteers that put this all together.
Yeah, I mean, this building was in really rough shape. I mean, but before we get to that, let's go all the way back. So when was this building built?
Well, the brewery itself started in 1852. This building goes back to 1854. Now, although additions were made through the years, the main core of the building is 1854. So if I put that into historical perspective, it was here before Abraham Lincoln was elected president and 7 years before the American Civil War.
Holy cow. Yeah, so it's been here for a good long time, and it's had its, ups and downs through the years until it finally was purchased by...
Well, it was started by Gabriel Hale, and it was purchased in 1886 by Adam Schumacher.
Okay.
And then it closed in 1972.
Closed in 1972, where it sat pretty much vacant for
It did.
the better part of 3 decades.
Exactly right. In fact, when they closed, everything went up for auction, and the building was really kind of destroyed. People would knock through walls to take out copper kettles
Sure.
or iron pipes or whatever they could salvage. So that made the restoration even more difficult and more challenging.
Oh, I'm sure. So, we're closing in on the turn of the century, and somebody says, well, we need to do something with this building, with this great piece of history in our community. Tell me a little bit about that, the genesis of that concept.
Well, what happened in the mid-'70s to the late '70s, there was a change in industry in America.
A lot of consolidation.
A lot of consolidation, outsourcing, robotic technology. A lot of people who lived in Potosi, Tennyson area, they worked in Dubuque at John Deere, the Dubuque Pack, but those industries were changing, and we were afraid, there was a group that was afraid that we were going to become a dying community like so many other small communities. And so a group of volunteers got together, thanks to Gary David and his cousin Dennis David, who purchased this building for back taxes, and the nonprofit Potosi Brewery Foundation was formed, and we set out to resurrect this building and make it economically viable for the community once again.
That was before, craft beer really made it into the lexicon of America.
Very much so.
What drove you people to do that?
I think a love for the community. We did not want Potosi to become a dying community. I mean, if you look across Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, across the entire United States, there are small communities that are dying. Some of them have already died.
Right.
Some are in the process of dying. We did not want that to happen to the Potosi, Tennyson area, so that's the reason for engaging and restoring this project.
A lot of love went into this.
A lot of love.
And a lot of assistance, not only from the local community, but also from the ABA, the American Breweriana Association?
The American Breweriana Association, they're the ones that put in the National Museum, which houses about $2 to $3 million worth of artifacts.
Really? Why don't we go upstairs and take a look at some of that?
We certainly can do that.
We came up here, and I've been here a few times, but every time I'm here, I'm overwhelmed just with the amount of artifacts that are here. So tell me a little bit about this museum. It's the ABA Museum. How did that get here exactly?
Well, the American Breweriana Association had always wanted a national museum, and Milwaukee was interested in it, St. Louis, certainly two cities with history and heritage of beer making,
Right.
but they ended up here in Potosi. One reason, we had a building, the other communities didn't. We had done a feasibility study, the other communities hadn't. We had a building, it was in terrible shape, but at least we had a building.
Right.
And what better place to put in a National Brewery Museum than in what was a family-owned brewery? Because that's how the brewery's business started.
Right.
Before the big corporations, took over, they were all family-owned breweries. And so this seemed like a natural fit. And we're very, very glad that they did. And you mentioned the artifacts.
Yeah.
You had talked to me earlier about the advertising and how you were interested in that.
I love advertising. I love graphic design. It's one of my passions. And if you want to come to a place, you can just see a multitude of different styles, different eras, and really get a feel about, how design changed over the years.
Well, see, I'm glad that, we talked about that because there are people who I've taken on tour through here and they have no interest in the history of breweries per se, but they're fascinated to look at the advertising and how the advertising is a reflection of a different time period. In a certain sense, you can almost get a history of the United States and the cultural values by looking at the advertising that is abounding here.
Yeah, from the 1880s, through the Cold War 1950s, I'd say almost the heyday of, the mid-level brewery, all the way through today. And just all kinds of different artifacts. From signage to advertising, but also to chairs. There's the tavern chairs.
They're in the next room, the chairs. But,
yeah, it's really quite something. Out of everything here, do you have a certain thing that just really speaks to you? Is there a certain room or section that you find to be the most interesting?
Couple of things. One is this sign right down here. It's a Joseph Schlitz sign that dates back to 1885. But there's something very interesting on that sign. If you look in the corner, it says Budweiser. Now, why is there Budweiser on a Schlitz sign? Those are two different companies.
Right.
Well, Budweiser was and is a Czechoslovakian style of beer. And in 1885, there were many breweries that made a Budweiser. It wasn't until 6 years later, in 1891, that the Bush family took Budweiser as a brand name for their product.
Really?
Then the other breweries either stopped making Budweiser or they gave it a different name because they didn't want to give free advertising to their competitor. So that's why there's Budweiser on a Schlitz sign.
That's interesting. Yeah, and there's all these little things, these little nuggets of, interesting information that are just piled into brewery history.
Well, the other thing that I find fascinating is in one of the rooms upstairs, there are children used in advertising beer. Now, we could never get away with that today, but I'm going to paraphrase Benjamin Franklin. He said, "In wine there is wisdom, in beer there is freedom, in water there is sickness or bacteria." There was a time when it was actually safer to drink the wine and the beer than it was to drink the water from a city water system. Now our waters are tested, but just about whatever community you live in. But back then that was not the case. And I know, for example, 1894, the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago, they were so worried about a cholera epidemic from the Chicago water system that they piped in all the water for that World's Fair from Waukesha, Wisconsin. So children used in advertising beer was not unusual since the children were drinking the beer and the wine, not obviously to the degree that their parents were, but they grew up drinking it because it was safer.
Now, I've got to ask, you're surrounded by all of this brewery stuff. Do you like beer?
I drink a beer occasionally, but I'm not crazy about it. And, I know some people, if they have one beer, they have to have two, and if they have two, they have to have three. I can have one beer with a meal, and I'm satisfied.
Yeah, I like beer, but it's interesting that you can enjoy the history, you can enjoy the design, you can enjoy all the different aspects of brewing and brewery history, and not necessarily enjoy the alcohol part. And that's what I love about this museum.
Well, one of the things that fascinated me really, when I went up to Stevens Point with the Breweriana Association, they had their convention there, and I thought, my goodness, is this going to be a bunch of drunks wandering down the hallway of a hotel with funny hats or something or other? A lot of them aren't drinkers at all. They're historians, and that's what they're interested in, is preserving history. They're not interested in drinking.
Right. Well, Frank, this is a great gem, and it's certainly off the beaten path, but it's well worth the visit.
I think it's well worth a visit. I do.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.